The White House has authorized the deployment of a U.S. Marine Expeditionary Unit to the Middle East. The Wall Street Journal confirmed the deployment, citing a Pentagon official. It is not a training exercise. It is not a preparatory maneuver. It is not a show of force designed to communicate resolve without operational follow-through. It is an active deployment order for a self-contained combat force. And in the institutional language of American military operations, this specific type of unit has a specific and well-documented historical function that the official framing of this announcement is carefully not stating directly. A Marine Expeditionary Unit is approximately 2,500 infantry troops operating with organic artillery, armored support, dedicated air assets, and full logistics self-sufficiency. They carry their own fuel, their own ammunition, their own medical capability, and their own command structure. They are designed to operate independently in a hostile environment for a sustained period without relying on established forward infrastructure. More specifically, they are designed to be the first force into a contested environment to arrive, secure an entry point against active opposition, hold that perimeter under fire, and prepare conditions for the larger follow-on forces whose arrival they are designed to enable. They are the door. Everything that comes after them walks through it. The base they are deploying from is located in the California desert and is specialized in a very specific training profile: arid terrain combat, extreme temperature operations, the tactical and logistical challenges that characterize warfare in desert environments. That is not a coincidence. That base exists to prepare forces for exactly the operational conditions they would encounter in Iran and across the Gulf region. The combination of the unit type, the originating base, and the destination theater tells a story that the official announcement is communicating through institutional language rather than direct statement. This is how large military interventions have historically begun, not with a formal declaration of war submitted to Congress for the constitutionally required authorization, not with a public announcement that an invasion is being planned, with a forward deployment of a self-sufficient expeditionary unit whose institutional purpose is to arrive first and prepare conditions for everything that follows, and whose presence in theater creates the forward infrastructure and the political momentum that makes subsequent escalation progressively easier to execute and progressively harder to reverse. If you are not yet subscribed to FRUM Report, do it now and turn on notifications before continuing. What is being announced here, and equally important, what is being signaled by the specific way it was announced, through which channel, from which source, at this specific moment in the conflict, has implications for the trajectory of this war that extend far beyond the headline. The analysis that follows will go through all of it. The manner in which this deployment became public is itself one of the most analytically significant elements of the entire announcement, and it deserves careful examination before addressing the operational questions, because understanding why this information was released the way it was released changes how you interpret what is actually being communicated. This information was not leaked by a whistleblower with a conscience. It was not obtained through investigative journalism, through FOA requests, or through the kind of source cultivation that produces genuinely unauthorized disclosures. It was provided to the Wall Street Journal by a Pentagon official. That means it went through a deliberate institutional decision to share this specific information with this specific outlet at this specific moment. In Washington's information architecture, that is not a leak. It is a controlled release, a deliberate disclosure designed to produce a specific set of reactions in specific audiences simultaneously. The audiences for this announcement are at least three, and they are receiving different messages from the same disclosure. For the American domestic audience, the message is that the administration is responding to 15 days of Iranian strikes with escalation rather than accommodation, that the trajectory is forward rather than toward the kind of negotiated exit that the publicly stated Iranian ceasefire conditions, which every analyst describes as impossible to accept, would require. This is a politically important signal for an administration managing domestic perception of a conflict that has produced 19 American military deaths, 140 wounded, a downed KC-135, repositioned carrier groups, and a destroyed airport that Iron Dome could not defend. For allied governments watching from Europe, the Gulf, and Asia, the message is that Washington is deepening its commitment rather than searching for an exit, which creates pressure on those governments to clarify their own positions, potentially moving some toward more active support and others toward more explicit public distance. For FRUM, the message is the most direct. This is what is coming. The deployment announcement is a coercive signal, an attempt to alter Iranian calculations by making the cost of continued operations visible before those operations occur. Whether that coercive signal will produce the behavioral change it is designed to produce, or whether it will instead accelerate Iranian preparations for exactly the kind of ground force engagement that its military doctrine has been designed around for decades, is the central operational question. This analysis will address to understand what deploying 2,500 Marines into this specific theater at this specific moment actually means operationally. It is necessary to first establish the conditions those Marines would be entering, because those conditions are the most important variable in assessing whether this deployment represents a credible escalatory threat or a strategic miscalculation of the first order. The United States does not currently control the airspace over the Gulf theater. This is not a speculative analytical judgment. It is documented by the operational record of the past 16 days. 4 American combat aircraft were lost in Kuwait. A KC-135 refueling tanker, one of the largest, most operationally critical, and least expendable support platforms in the American inventory, went down over western Iraq with 6 crew members. The New York Times satellite imagery analysis confirmed that at least 17 American military-related facilities across the Gulf region have sustained damage, with 11 confirmed as American military installations in Qatar, Kuwait, and Bahrain. Several of those installations were struck more than once. Damage was confirmed near TPY, 2 radar dome installations, the tracking backbone of THAAD missile defense batteries, which function as the eyes of the interception network. Without functioning radar, interceptor missiles cannot accurately calculate firing solutions. The interception mathematics collapses at the source. 2 carrier strike groups, the Abraham Lincoln and the Gerald Ford, have repositioned away from their forward operational positions. The official characterizations of those movements have not used the word withdrawal. The operational picture documented through satellite imagery, open-source tracking, and regional reporting describes something that functions as withdrawal, regardless of how it is officially designated. This is the operational environment into which the Marine Expeditionary Unit is being deployed. Degraded airspace, damaged regional base infrastructure, mined waterways, repositioned naval assets, an early warning radar network that has been systematically targeted and partially destroyed, and an adversary that has spent 16 days demonstrating offensive capabilities that pre-war assessments did not model accurately, and that has explicitly designed its ground force defensive doctrine around the specific challenge of defeating exactly the kind of amphibious and expeditionary landing that American Marine units are trained to execute. Ground forces require air cover. Air cover requires secure airspace. Marine Expeditionary Units are designed to operate under air superiority, the operational condition in which friendly air assets control the skies above the landing force, suppressing enemy air defense, providing close air support for troops in contact, and maintaining the logistical air bridge that sustains a force in the field. Remove air superiority, and the operational calculus changes fundamentally. You have infantry operating in contested terrain without the protective air architecture that American ground force doctrine has been built around since the Second World War. The question that every serious defense analyst examining this deployment announcement is asking is not whether 2,500 Marines are capable of fighting. They are among the most capable ground forces in the world. The question is what they can accomplish operationally in a theater where air superiority has not been established, where the naval routes that would support their supply chain have been mined and are under active missile threat, where the regional bases that would provide forward logistics support have been repeatedly struck and partially destroyed, and where the adversary has publicly stated through official military channels, not through anonymous briefings or social media, that it welcomes the deployment and is fully prepared to engage it on the ground. Iran's military response to the announcement was calibrated and immediate. The ground forces are welcome. The Iranian military has been preparing for exactly this scenario for years. Its defensive doctrine is built around the assumption that American air dominance will eventually be followed by ground force employment and its layered anti-access area denial architecture. The mines in the waterways, the missiles that target logistics nodes, the drone swarms that saturate air defense, the concealed launcher networks that cannot be mapped from the air, is specifically designed to make that ground force employment as costly as possible before the first boot touches Iranian soil. While the deployment announcement was being processed, the diplomatic dimension of the American strategic position revealed itself in a way that deserves equal analytical attention, because the diplomatic picture and the military picture are telling the same story from different angles. Trump called on China, France, Japan, South Korea, and the United Kingdom to send naval vessels to the Strait of Hormuz to help secure the waterway for commercial transit. The public framing was a coalition appeal, a call to allies and partners to share the burden of maintaining freedom of navigation in one of the world's most critical energy corridors. The analytical reading is considerably less comfortable than that framing suggests. When a government that launched a unilateral military operation without consulting its closest regional partners calls publicly on China to send warships to a waterway whose closure it is responsible for creating, that is not the behavior of a coalition leader managing a coordinated multinational response. It is the behavior of an administration that has run the available unilateral options to their current operational limits and is now attempting to recruit participation from governments. It did not consult before the conflict began. France, Japan, South Korea, and the United Kingdom have not responded affirmatively to the appeal. The Gulf Arab states have publicly declined to participate in offensive operations. The Emirati billionaire's open letter, read by every government in the region, named the oil motive explicitly and told Washington to keep its hands off the Gulf. The coalition that was apparently assumed to materialize in support of this operation when it was planned has not materialized. The countries named publicly in the appeal have not sent ships. The multilateral legitimacy that would transform a unilateral American operation into a defensible collective action has not been obtained. China's response was precisely calibrated in the way that Beijing's diplomatic language always is, communicating maximum meaning through minimum explicit commitment. A spokesperson for the Chinese embassy in Washington called for an immediate ceasefire. The embassy declined to specify whether China would send naval vessels to the Strait. China characterized itself as a sincere friend and strategic partner of the Middle Eastern countries involved, stated that it would continue strengthening communication with all relevant parties, including the parties in conflict, and described its constructive role as facilitating de-escalation and restoring peace. In the language of professional diplomacy, that response is a no. It is a no wrapped in the vocabulary of constructive engagement. But every foreign ministry analyst reading it understands precisely what it communicates. China is not going to deploy naval assets to clean up an operational problem that a unilateral American military decision created. China is not going to provide the multilateral legitimacy that American unilateralism failed to generate before the conflict began. China is positioning itself as the neutral adult in the room, the party calling for ceasefire, facilitating communication, and declining to be conscripted into a coalition whose objectives it opposed from the outset. The strategic significance of China's refusal extends beyond the immediate naval question. The one partner whose presence in the Strait would carry independent strategic weight, because Chinese flagged vessels, Chinese energy import dependence, and Chinese diplomatic relationships with both sides give Beijing leverage over Hormuz access questions that no Western Navy possesses, has declined to provide that presence. If China wanted the Strait open for its own energy supply, it has the diplomatic tools to negotiate access independently of American military operations. Its choice to call for ceasefire rather than deploy vessels is a choice about which outcome it considers more strategically valuable. The Strait itself has evolved from a simple military closure into something considerably more sophisticated as a strategic instrument. And understanding that evolution is essential to understanding both why the coalition appeal failed and why the marine deployment announcement lands in this specific context. Iran has communicated through official channels that the Strait of Hormuz is open. That statement requires its full context to be analytically meaningful. The Strait is open for commercial vessels from countries not actively supporting the American military operation in this conflict. Chinese tankers may transit, Indian tankers may transit, non-aligned country vessels may transit. The closure applies specifically to vessels from the United States, Israel, and the countries whose governments have actively supported or participated in the military operations against Iran. The practical effect of that condition is a targeted economic embargo against the Western coalition rather than a universal blockade. This is strategically more sophisticated than a blanket closure, for a reason that becomes clear when you examine the diplomatic consequences. A universal closure affects every country's energy supply simultaneously, including China, India, Russia, and the global South nations whose diplomatic support Iran needs to sustain its international position. Universal closures generate universal opposition and create pressure from Iran's own supporters to reopen. A targeted closure that permits non-aligned traffic while blocking American-aligned supply chains applies maximum economic pressure on the intended targets while preserving the energy access of the countries whose diplomatic support Iran depends on. It turns the Strait into a precision instrument rather than a blunt one. Every day the targeted closure holds, the economic pressure on Western coalition countries compounds, energy prices rise for their populations, supply chain disruptions spread to agriculture, manufacturing and transportation. Insurance markets price an extended conflict, and the political pressure on Washington to find an acceptable exit, any exit that can be framed as not a defeat, intensifies in ways that eventually produce behavioral changes that direct military pressure has not. The Strait of Hormuz carries approximately 20% of globally traded oil. The mines that Iran has been laying in the waterway are not primarily a threat to warships with sophisticated mine countermeasure systems. They are a threat to the commercial tanker captains and their insurers, who must decide whether any cargo value justifies sailing into a mined waterway, regardless of naval escort presence. Mine clearing, not escort operations, not diplomatic statements, not coalition appeals, is the operational prerequisite for any realistic resumption of commercial transit, and mine clearing has not been confirmed as underway at the scale required to make the Strait navigable for deep draft commercial vessels. The historical comparison that defense analysts and military historians are drawing to this moment deserves serious engagement rather than dismissal, because the pattern it identifies is not speculative. It is documented. On March 8, 1965, approximately 3,500 United States Marines landed at Da Nang in Vietnam. The official characterization at the time was precisely what the official characterization of this deployment announcement is today: a protective mission, a limited deployment to secure specific installations, a forward presence designed to enable operations without constituting the kind of large-scale ground war that would require public acknowledgement and congressional authorization. Nobody in the official briefings on March 8, 1965, was describing what was beginning as the opening movement of a conflict that would eventually deploy more than 500,000 American military personnel to jungle terrain and return an uncountable portion of them in body bags. The parallel is imperfect in its specifics. Vietnam and Iran are different countries with different geographies, different military doctrines, different historical contexts, and different relationships to American strategic interests. The comparison is not a prediction of identical outcomes. It is an identification of a pattern, the pattern by which limited expeditionary deployments described in their initial framing as protective and contained have historically functioned as the operational entry point for escalatory sequences that produced outcomes that bore no resemblance to what the initial framing suggested was being initiated. The mechanism by which that pattern operates is not mysterious. A forward deployment creates facts on the ground. Those facts create operational requirements, force protection, logistic security, and air cover that generate pressure for additional deployments to fulfill those requirements. Each additional deployment creates its own facts and its own requirements. The political momentum generated by troops in theater makes de-escalation and withdrawal progressively more difficult to execute without the kind of domestic political cost that administration consistently choose to defer rather than absorb. And the adversary, whose doctrine is built around making the cost of each incremental escalation higher than the last, is incentivized to engage the forward force in ways that generate exactly the political pressure for escalation that the pattern describes. The operational environment comparison is the most important element of the historical parallel. In 1965, the United States had significant air superiority over Vietnam at the moment of the Da Nang landing. It had established forward bases, functioning logistics networks, and the regional infrastructure that ground force employment requires. It still produced the outcome it produced. The Marine Expeditionary Unit, now being deployed to the Middle East, is being sent into a theater where air superiority has not been established, where forward bases have been systematically damaged, where waterways have been mined, where two carrier groups have repositioned away from their forward positions, and where the adversary has spent 16 days demonstrating offensive capabilities that pre-war assessments failed to anticipate. The summary that the past 16 days of this conflict produces is one that the official narrative has consistently been running behind. 16 days ago, Iran was characterized in mainstream assessments as a country whose military capacity would be decisively degraded within 48 hours of the opening strikes. 16 days later, 54 waves of offensive operations launched. Ben Gurion International Airport destroyed. 73 aircraft burned, 89 killed, Israel's only international airport closed with a repair timeline of 6 to 12 months. The Strait of Hormuz effectively closed to Western shipping, with mines actively being laid. Two carrier strike groups repositioned. A KC-135 downed with 6 crew members. 3 F-15s lost in combat, more in 16 days than in the previous 50 years of the aircraft's operational history combined. 140 Americans wounded, 19 evacuated to Germany. The Iron Dome fired 31 interceptors at Ben Gurion and stopped 0 missiles. Ultra-heavy missiles struck Israeli decision-making infrastructure for the first time. The Silayil solid-fuel strategic missile was deployed in combat for the first time. Netanyahu was formally declared absent from his own war cabinet at the conflict's most critical moment. And Trump called on China to send warships to a strait that China declined to enter. The country that was not supposed to last 48 hours is on day 16. It is escalating the technical sophistication of its weapons employment. It is expanding its targeting to include leadership infrastructure. It is coordinating its operations with Hezbollah at a level of command coherence that Israeli military sources describe as inconsistent with months of official characterizations of Hezbollah as a degraded and weakened force. And it has just told the world that the ground forces Washington is now deploying are welcome. None of that trajectory supports the deployment of an expeditionary unit whose operational success depends on conditions: air superiority, secured waterways, functional forward base infrastructure. That 16 days of this conflict have systematically degraded the question of whether this deployment represents a credible strategic escalation or a desperate attempt to create momentum in a conflict that has not developed according to plan is the most important analytical question this channel will track as the situation develops. Subscribe to FRUM Report and turn on notifications. When the Marine Expeditionary Unit's destination and mission parameters are confirmed, when China's formal diplomatic response solidifies, when the allied governments named in the coalition appeal provide their definitive answers, when the operational consequences of deploying ground forces into this specific environment begin to become visible, the analysis will be here. This channel reads the documents, examines the operational evidence, and connects the elements that the official narrative keeps separate. Evidence first, analysis second, what it means for you. Always leave your answer in the comments. Does deploying ground forces into a theater where air superiority has not been established, waterways have been mined, and the adversary has explicitly invited the confrontation represent a strategic escalation with a defined achievable objective, or does it represent something else? Every response gets read. This is from Review.